Secretary General, United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, and Ms. Natalie German, Executive Director, Counterterrorism Committee, Executive Directorate. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2024/5A3, the 19th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by ISIL to international peace and security and the range of United Nations effort in support of member states in countering the threat. I now give the floor to Mr. Vladimir Voronkov.
Mr. President, Excellencies, it's an honor to brief the Security Council on the 19th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by Daesh to international peace and security, and the United Nations efforts in support of member states to counter this threat. I am pleased to be joined by Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, Ms. Natalia German, to present this report, which was prepared jointly by our offices and the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team. As we approach the International Day of Remembrance of and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism on 21st August, I would like to express my condolences to member states that have been affected by acts of terrorism and my sympathy to the victims and their families. In honor of this day, the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism will organize a high-level event to highlight the role of victims of terrorism as peace advocates. My office will continue to support member states in promoting survivor-centered, gender-sensitive, and human rights compliant approaches. Mr. President, Excellencies, unfortunately, the situation in parts of Africa has not improved since my last briefing. The terrorism landscape in West Africa and the Sahel remains challenging and complex. Terrorist groups continue to expand in the Sahel and inflict high casualties, undermining regional stability. Two of the Daesh affiliates in the region, the Islamic State West Africa province and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahel, have expanded and consolidated their areas of operations. Should these groups extend their influence in northern littoral states, a vast territory stretching from Mali to northern Nigeria could fall under their effective control. In other parts of the continent, Daesh affiliates have increased their operational pace in northern Mozambique, as well as in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, where a dramatic increase in terrorist attacks resulted in high civilian fatalities. Also in Somalia, the Daesh affiliate has become stronger. Mr. President, Excellencies, two of the risks outlined in reports over the past years have regrettably become manifest since my last briefing. The first is the risk of ISIL-K, the Daesh affiliate in Afghanistan, carried out terrorist attacks abroad. ISIL-K has improved its financial and logistical capabilities in the past 6 months, including by tapping into Afghan and Central Asian diasporas for support. The group has also intensified its recruitment efforts. The activity of Daesh and other terrorist groups in Afghanistan remains a significant concern. We must unite to prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a hotbed of terrorism. In this regard, the efforts of neighboring member states to counter and prevent the spread of threat emanating from Afghanistan is very important. The Office of Counterterrorism will continue to support member states in Central Asia in implementing the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorist Strategy. The second risk that has materialized in the reporting period refers to the resurgence of Daesh core. The group has claimed responsibility for the attacks conducted by ISIL-K globally, seeking to derive propaganda value for this cause. In early January, the group demonstrated its continued global intent, launching a coordinated campaign across all its self-proclaimed provinces. This included temporary surges of operations in January and March in Iraq, where operations had been otherwise largely contained. Daesh has also increased its operational pace in the Syrian Arab Republic with a surge of attacks, especially in the central desert area. Sustained counterterrorism efforts will be required to prevent Daesh from building upon these gains. Further efforts will also be required to address the dire security, humanitarian, and human rights situation of camps and other detention facilities in the northeast of the Syrian Arab Republic. Some progress made by member states in repatriating their nationals resulted in a slight decrease in the population of these camps. However, thousands of individuals continue to live in dire conditions. The camps are overcrowded, lacking in adequate shelter and basic services, including clean water and medical care. The Secretary General continues to call for member states with their nationals stranded in these camps to scale up their efforts to facilitate the safe, voluntary, and dignified repatriation of their citizens. Elsewhere, the threat posed by ISIL-K resulted in heightened threat levels in Europe. The group is considered the greatest external terrorist threat to the continent. Mr. President, Excellencies, cooperation among member states remains indispensable to address the threat posed by Daesh. For this reason, the Office of Counterterrorism supported the government of Nigeria in organizing the high-level African counterterrorism meeting in Abuja in April. I welcome the outcomes reflected in the Abuja Declaration and look forward to working closely with member states in supporting the agreed actions. This includes the upgrade of the Nigerian National Counterterrorist Center in Abuja to a regional counterterrorist center that will cover the Sahel and West Africa. Given the complexity of the threat in the region, my office is committed to supporting the center's initiative to address the drivers of terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. Looking ahead, the Office of Counterterrorism is jointly organizing with the government of Tajikistan and Kuwait the Dushanbe High-Level Process Conference in Kuwait City in November. The event will be the fourth iteration of the Dushanbe process and is intended to broaden the scope and impact of regional counterterrorism cooperation well beyond Central Asia. But cooperation alone will not suffice unless it leads to responses that are comprehensively and firmly grounded on political strategies. While responses may sometimes require the legitimate use of force, such force must be aligned with broader strategies. These strategies should be aimed at addressing the multifaceted drivers of terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. And such responses must be fully compliant with international human rights and humanitarian law. Mr. President, Excellencies, terrorism remains a significant challenge for the international community that no state can tackle alone. To eradicate the terrorist threat, we need inclusive, multilateral responses that are firmly grounded on political strategies compliant with international law, also informed by all of society and all of government approaches. The upcoming Summit of the Future represents a critical opportunity for member states to recommit to countering terrorism and preventing violent extremism along those lines. The Office of Counterterrorism, including through the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, will continue to support and work in partnership with member states to realize that vision. I thank you.
Distinguished delegates, I'm very pleased to address the and head of the UN Office of Counterterrorism, Mr. Countering Terrorism. West and Central Africa have in complex attacks against security forces and civilians. This has led from Islamic State West Africa province, contributing to the displacement of more than 2.9 million people as of May 2024. Continue to face capacity challenges to manage the escalation City Hall in Moscow in March, and with affiliates demonstrating progress has also been made by member states. Ten member states the United Nations continued to support the prosecution included implementing specialized rehabilitation programs of Daesh, including those of April. CETAT published a report border security involving local communities and addressing conditions conducive to challenges that can be shared by other member states in the region and conflict-affected areas around the world. The criminalization and codification of terrorist offenses in accordance with Security Council resolutions. The meeting highlighted good practices in defining terrorism offenses with full respect for the principle of legality and fundamental freedoms. The United Nations also continued to work with member states to counter the financing of terrorism. And in this regard, CETAT further enhanced its cooperation with its global research network. In May, CETAT hosted the Financial Action Task Force President to the Counterterrorism Committee to discuss implementation of international standards against the financing of terrorism. Mr. President, the United Nations has also been actively involved in initiatives aimed at transitional rehabilitation and justice, as well as improving social cohesion. And in conclusion, let me reaffirm CETAT's commitment to working closely with member states, international, regional and sub-regional organizations, civil society and the private sector. And to this end, we believe that a one UN approach is crucial in our common endeavors to effectively combat terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Thank you.
I thank Ms. German for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statement. I give the floor to the representative of United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Undersecretary General Voronkov and Executive Director German, for the joint preparation of the 19th ISIL report and for your briefings. The United States shares the Secretary General's concern regarding ISIS-Khorasan's ability to conduct attacks outside of Afghanistan, as we saw with the horrific terrorist attacks in Kerman on January 3 and Moscow on March 22 that resulted in hundreds of deaths. The Taliban have made efforts to counter ISIS-K, and it is critical they adhere to their counterterrorism commitments. Similarly, we remain particularly focused on the terrorism threat across Africa, outlined in the Secretary General's report. We share his concern over developments in West Africa and the Sahel, as well as in Central and Southern Africa, where the situation is fragile with the prospect of greater instability. We continue to provide our African partners essential assistance in degrading the capabilities and countering ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliates in a manner consistent with international law. Capable law enforcement and broader security service responses are vital to preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism. In this vein, the United States welcomed the adoption of Resolution 2734, which extended the mandate of the UN 1267 sanctions regime. We welcome the Council's recognition that sexual and gender-based violence is a strategy that terrorists use to further their nefarious aims, which was recognized in Resolution 2734 as a potential ground for sanctions listings. Promoting accountability for conflict-related sexual violence is a priority for the United States. Pursuant to the Presidential Memorandum on Promoting Accountability for Conflict-Related Sexual Violence last December, the United States issued sanctions against 4 leaders from the ISIS affiliate in the Democratic Republic of the Congo who killed, maimed, and committed sexual violence against women and girls. Resolution 2734 is a critical step forward for the global campaign to end gender-based violence. We encourage the Security Council and member states to nominate individuals, including terrorist operatives and facilitators, to be sanctioned for committing or enabling these types of offenses. We encourage member states in need of assistance to avail themselves of sanctions and other tools and to play an active role in updating and implementing UN 1267 sanctions to counter ISIS and al-Qaeda. The United States continues to prioritize the repatriation of detained non-Syrian ISIS fighters and displaced ISIS-associated family members, because the return of these individuals to their communities of origin is integral to securing the enduring defeat of ISIS. The United States, therefore, welcomes the efforts of member states that have repatriated their nationals, especially Iraq. Over the past 3 years, nearly 11,000 displaced individuals have been repatriated, including more than 5,000 in the last 12 months. This trend reflects a general increase in the willingness of countries of origin to make the difficult but necessary decisions to repatriate their nationals from the region. Still, the situation in the displaced person camps of Al-Hol and Raj in Syria constitutes an urgent humanitarian, human rights, and security challenge. More than 43,000 people reside in these camps, the majority of whom are children. Countries of origin must do more, and more quickly, to repatriate their nationals from northeast Syria. The United States recognizes the importance of partnerships with civil society across the work of the UN Counterterrorism Compact. The inclusion of civil society, particularly local women leaders, is essential in ensuring member states and the UN system are accounting for all voices and perspectives. As called for in Resolution 2734, the United States looks forward to continued Secretary General reporting that highlights the impact of UN counterterrorism efforts. The Secretary General's report correctly recognizes that the fight against terrorism requires comprehensive efforts beyond security-centered approaches. The international community must continue investing in whole-of-society approaches that respect human rights and the rule of law in order to effectively prevent and counter the spread of ISIS and other terrorist groups. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Under-Secretary Voronkov and Executive Director German for their briefings. I also thank the monitoring team for their work on the report. The UK remains deeply concerned about the rising threat from Daesh and its affiliates. Whilst Daesh has been unable to resurge territorially, it continues to propagate its poisonous ideology globally. Its branches present an acute threat to at-risk communities, whilst its propaganda seeks to exploit global events to inspire terrorist violence across the world. The increasing threat from Daesh's continued focus on Africa, including attacks from Daesh affiliates ISWAP and ISSP in West Africa and the Sahel, threatens regional stability. And as the Secretary-General report notes, their activities in the region afflict grave violations on children and in particular girls. This Council's recent decision to include sexual and gender-based violence as a criterion for listing under the 1267 regime sends a strong message that these crimes should not go unpunished. The development of African-led initiatives like the Abuja process are a crucial response. Working closely with regional economic communities and with the support of UN entities, the African Union plays a central role in these efforts. The Malabo Declaration for a whole-of-government and a whole-of-society approaches to tackling terrorism was a positive step forward, and we stand ready to support the development of national action plans. It is vital that these collective approaches work to address the underlying drivers of terrorism, including reducing corruption, improving governance, and ensuring respect for the rule of law. The threat from ISKP is increasing, and in recent months we have seen abhorrent attacks by groups on civilians in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and Turkey. This emphasises our need to tackle ISKP collectively as the international community and take a creative approach to understand how they operate, starve their resources, and tackle their propaganda. As part of this effort, the UK launched the ISKP diplomatic grouping in May 2023 to focus its increasing threat with regional partners. The grouping convened most recently in Doha last month to share expertise and to drive action on countering ISKP finance, travel, and propaganda. Attacks on military bases in Iraq are increasing tensions across the Middle East, perpetuating instability and threatening Iraq and the coalition's collective ability to counter Daesh. De-escalation should be a collective priority, and we call for the continued work with partners to suppress the threat. As we mark 10 years since Daesh perpetrated genocide against the Yazidi people, we cannot lose focus in the fight against Daesh as it spreads to new theatres. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Undersecretary General Voronkov and Executive Director Herman for their briefings. I also thank the monitoring team for its work on the reports. Japan remains deeply concerned by the fact that terrorism continues to be a serious threat to international peace and security, despite efforts by member states and UN entities. ISIL Khorasan is reported to have been responsible for a series of high-profile attacks and is now seen no longer as a potential threat, but a manifest one that threatens the entire globe. We are also alarmed by reports that ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates are exploiting new and emerging technologies. The increasing use of anonymity-enhancing cryptocurrencies, also known as privacy coins, is concerning. The exploitation of 3D printing to manufacture weapons and unmanned aerial systems can be a serious loophole in arms embargoes. Mr. President, I commend your leadership in raising attention about West Africa and the Sahel today. Unfortunately, the region continues to be one of the major centers of terrorism and violent extremism. According to the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism, both the number of incidents of terrorism and their fatalities have been significantly increasing. Let me highlight the following 3 points. First, we must address conditions conducive to terrorism and violent extremism with a long-term and comprehensive approach. A security-centered approach alone is insufficient to counter this threat, the rise of which has not happened in isolation. Terrorists and violent extremism are exploiting societal fragility caused by the multifaceted challenges the region faces, such as political instability, poverty, and the devastating effects of climate change. Therefore, Japan reiterates the importance of adopting a holistic approach, utilizing a human security lens and promoting the humanitarian development peace nexus. Second, people must be at the center of the efforts, of all efforts, especially those who are most affected by adversity, such as women, youth, and minorities. Human dignity must be respected in all circumstances. Neglecting gender consideration can weaken counter-terrorism efforts and potentially exacerbate the conditions that lead to terrorism and violent extremism. Hence, it is crucial to address sexual and gender-based violence, which is utilized by terrorists for strategic purposes. In this regard, Japan believes the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2734 was an important milestone. We also note that the 1267 sanctions regime is a practical tool at this Council's disposal, and it is our responsibility to utilize it effectively. Third, a transnational perspective is essential, as many challenges, including terrorism, violent extremism, and climate change, know no borders. The international community should incorporate efforts by the entire UN system, as well as international financial institutions, regional and sub-regional organizations, and civil society. To this end, Japan congratulates the successful holding of the high-level African Center Terrorism meeting in Abuja this April. Mr. President, in closing, I wish to say one more thing. Let us not forget the sexual violence perpetrated by ISIL against the Yazidi community 10 years ago. Those who committed such acts must be held accountable. We should not allow the same tragedy to happen anywhere, in any region in the world. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I extend my gratitude to Undersecretary General Voronkov and the Executive Director German for their informative briefings today. The Republic of Korea is deeply concerned by the continuing threat of terrorism and violent extremism across the globe, and in particular in West Africa, which led to the Sahel becoming the world's epicenter of terrorism. Today, I'd like to make 3 points. First, efforts should be made for the capacity building of states in the Sahel region to enhance border stability. As highlighted in the AU's 2020 border governance strategy, terrorists can exploit lack of governance in border areas, which exacerbates various security problems beyond such boundaries. A good example of such a capacity-building project includes the Countering Terrorism in Travel and Transport initiative under the UN Joint Appeal for Counterterrorism in Africa, to which the Republic of Korea financially contributed this year. This program aims at strengthening capacities to identify and prevent the movement of terrorists and organized criminal groups across borders. We look forward to seeing positive outcomes from this vital initiative. Second, all concerned countries in the region should strengthen their cooperation and coordination to counter terrorism. Given continued presence of Daesh affiliates in the region and in the wake of recent regional realignments, in particular the dissolution of G5 Sahel and the withdrawal of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger from ECOWAS led to a lack of coordinated regional responses, increasing the risk of continued expansion of terrorist groups across West Africa and the Sahel. In this context, we strongly support African-led initiatives for countering terrorism, including through the Accra Initiative, focused on regional cooperation and collective action. We also firmly back on the ongoing efforts of UNOWAS and CTC in enhancing regional cooperation on combating terrorism. Third, we appeal to the international community to promote the participation of local stakeholders, including women and youth, in designing tailored strategies for preventing violent extremism based on unique realities and needs on the ground. For instance, local women religious guides and community leaders known as Mushdat in Mauritania were trained extensively with the UN support and played an active role in preventing violent extremism within their local communities. Their vast knowledge of Islam and their roles as community leaders helps them to deconstruct radical rhetoric of extremist groups using religious arguments. As such, we urge all relevant actors, including government, civil society, and the UN agencies, to pay heed to the lessons learned and actively engage local stakeholders in PVE initiatives. Mr. President, today's briefing shows that the underlying causes of terrorism in the region are complex and require a holistic, whole-of-society approach in response. The Republic of Korea remains committed to supporting counterterrorism efforts in Africa, as emphasized in the joint declaration of the 2024 Korea-Africa Summit. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank USG Voronkov and ASG Gurman for their briefings. I would like to take this opportunity to commend both of them, as well as UNCTO and the CTED of the Security Council for their work. At present, terrorism continues to pose a threat to international peace and security. The threat posed by the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and its affiliated terrorist organizations continues unabated, and the terrorist activities are intertwined with ethnic conflicts and regional disputes. Since the beginning of this year, there have been frequent terrorist attacks from Europe and Asia to Africa, resulting in massive casualties. As the new round of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict continues to escalate, its spillover effects are constantly emerging, leading to a surge in hate crimes and an increased risk of terrorist attacks in many countries. These developments are a source of deep concern and disturbance. In the face of this complex and grim landscape for counterterrorism, the international community must strengthen solidarity, intensify cooperation, and jointly tackle challenges. I would like to make 3 points. First, to build international consensus and form the greatest possible synergy. Cooperation is the only powerful weapon in the fight against terrorism. Counterterrorism shouldn't become a tool for major power rivalry, a bargaining chip in geopolitics, or a pretext for interfering in other countries' internal affairs. All countries should uphold the concept of common security, abandon ideological bias, eradicate double standards or selectivity in counterterrorism efforts, and effectively respect and protect the security of each and every country. We must adhere to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter as our founding principle, uphold and practice true multilateralism, effectively play the central coordinating role of the UN in international counterterrorism efforts, fully implement Council and GA resolutions on counterterrorism, as well as the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, and jointly combat all terrorist organizations and individuals listed by the Council. States should step up cooperation at the national, regional, and global levels, actively advance the collective counterterrorism mechanism, and intensify counterterrorism cooperation efforts in the areas of early warning, financing, travel restrictions, border control, and intelligence exchange. Meanwhile, states should also, through in-depth research, address the impact of emerging technologies on the international fight against terrorism, deepen policy dialogue and pragmatic cooperation, and jointly tackle new threats and challenges in the area of counterterrorism. Second, to prioritize counterterrorism efforts and optimize the allocation of resources. The SG's report highlights that there is an increased risk of a resurgence of the Islamic State in the Middle East, about which the international community should stay highly vigilant, especially in preventing Afghanistan from once again becoming a hub for terrorist organizations. Africa has long been at the forefront of international counterterrorism efforts, with the situation in West Africa and the Sahel region being particularly grave. The UN and the international community should, based on the counterterrorism needs of the countries concerned, further increase allocated resources to help strengthen the legislative, judicial, and law enforcement capabilities of the countries concerned, and enhance their comprehensive counterterrorism and de-radicalization capabilities. Third, to tackle both the symptoms and the root causes of terrorism. It has been proved many times that terrorism cannot be completely eliminated purely through military means. Only by upholding a systematic concept, focusing on the long term and on the root causes, and taking a multifaceted approach in the economic, political, social, cultural, and religious fields, can we eliminate its root causes and ultimately achieve victory in the fight against terrorism. One of the main reasons that people in the Sahel region join violent extremist organizations is poverty, unemployment, and the lack of alternative means of living, which is quite common in terrorist-prone regions of Africa and the world at large. While countering terrorism, regional countries should focus on eradicating poverty, improving education, employment, and economy, and should further explore a development path in line with their national conditions. The international community should increase development assistance, support and help the countries concerned to resolve their debt and financing problems, and enhance their capabilities for sustainable socio-economic development. It is essential to promote a political settlement of regional conflicts and hotspot issues, improve the humanitarian situation in conflict areas, and prevent terrorist forces from taking advantage of the chaos. In this connection, I would like to make a special appeal to the international community to make concerted efforts to promote a ceasefire in Gaza as soon as possible, to ease tensions in the region as soon as possible, and to spare no effort in preventing further escalation of the conflict and confrontations, which could lead to even greater casualties and catastrophe. President, China has always attached great importance to and actively participated in international counterterrorism cooperation and has long been helping developing countries, African countries in particular, with counterterrorism capacity building through bilateral and multilateral means. Through the China UN Peace and Development Fund, we have supported UNCTO and the CTED of the Council in their cooperation projects in Nigeria, Mozambique, Somalia, and Djibouti, helping them tackle violent extremism and terrorism, and enhancing their law enforcement and counterterrorism capabilities. In the face of the new situation and new challenges, China will continue to work along with all parties to uphold a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable concept of security, with a view to making ongoing contributions to effectively addressing the threat of global terrorism and creating a world of lasting peace and universal security. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Thank you, President. We'd like to thank Vladimir Ivanovich Voronkov and Natalia Mirchevina-German for their briefings on the work of the UNOCT and the Executive Directorate of the CTC regarding assistance to states in fighting the terrorist threat. We highly value their work at this crucial area, and we will continue to provide them all assistance as necessary. We read very closely the Secretary-General's report on the threat posed by ISIL. The information about the ongoing high level of a threat and the evolution of the challenges is alarming. It reminds us that fighting terrorism is only possible together. However, unfortunately, against this backdrop, some states politicize the counterterrorism agenda. Double standards in the fight against terrorism, interference on the pretext of counterterrorism in the internal affairs of sovereign states, is now the calling card of Western countries who don't balk at using even international terrorist organizations for their own geopolitical purposes. Tame terrorists, destabilize developing countries. After that, the West, allegedly in order to fight them, shifts to the tried and tested tactic of destroying the state to plunder the natural and human resources of it. We will illustrate this argument with some specific examples, all substantiated by information contained in the Secretary-General's report. Let's start with the situation in Syria. ISIL is increasing its terrorist activity in this country. At the same time, terrorists are prospering in those regions which were illegally seized and are occupied by the US military. US military bases built in Syria as a result of the West's aggression against this country are used, inter alia, to pump out and smuggle Syrian oil, essentially to steal it. Around these bases, there is a real terrorist ghetto has formed. In the area where there are camps, where there are also people linked with ISIL and members of their families. The situation in these places is nothing but a humanitarian and food crisis. The declarative statements of Western colleagues who love to hold forth on the respect for human rights when carrying out counterterrorism measures, as always, are at odds with their real actions. Thus, the majority of Western states, despite many calls in the Secretary-General's reports, still refuse to return their citizens who are in these camps. EU countries have openly failed at this work and are not fulfilling their obligations on repatriation, accountability, rehabilitation and reintegration of foreign terrorist fighters and members of their family. President, particular attention should be paid to the activities of the terrorist group ISIL Khorasan, whose growing capabilities is something that we warned about long ago, at a time when NATO and US forces were still in Afghanistan. However, this information was deliberately ignored, and the growth and influence of this group was played down. And in the reports, there were reduced numbers on the number of fighters of this Afghan branch of ISIL. The scale of their spread is downplayed, and their ties in the region were underestimated. As a result, the international community did not pay due attention to fighting this structure, and then the group continued to develop untamed. Now, ISIL Khorasan is a threat not only to Afghanistan and the neighbouring region, but also to Europe. Indeed, we would caution those who try, before the end of the official investigation, to ascribe the terrorist attack in the Moscow region, the Crocus City Hall, on the 22nd of March, ascribe it exclusively to ISIL and ISIL Khorasan. If colleagues have proof of this, then I would invite them to share it with the specialised Russian bodies in charge of this. Sometimes we get the impression that some people know more about this act of terrorism than those who are investigating it. President, no less concerning is the situation linked with the activity of terrorists in the African continent. In the Secretary-General's report, it is highlighted that terrorist groups continue to focus their activities in Africa. In the sanctions monitoring group on ISIL and their affiliated individuals and entities in that report, which is now annexed to the Secretary-General's report, there is detail given to the merging of activities of terrorists in the region. It's stated that the permanent takeover of this territory by groups linked to ISIL and by the listed group JNIM in the Sahel still brings with it many victims and has an impact on regional security and stability. End of quote. It also contains information about these groups' intentions to sign non-aggression agreements with the CSP-PSD. In order to focus their efforts exclusively on Malian armed forces and on those who support the forces in the fight against terrorism in the north of the country. There is no longer any doubt that there is now cooperation between these groups. They share a territory where they carry out their activity, and amongst the other proof of the fact that they coordinate between themselves, the transfer of one of the members of the Arab movement, Azawad, to the CSP-PSD alongside tens of fighters to Janim. This fact is also reflected in the most recent report of the monitoring group. The situation is being compounded and the threat is evolving, not least because the interested countries don't deem it necessary even to try to camouflage their support for international terrorist organizations. States in the region on many occasions have brought forward information about systemic financing and training of fighters of these groups by France. Intelligence is gathered for members of Janim, and they are provided with weapons and ammunition. This goes as far as brazen cases when some states openly flaunt their support for international terrorist organizations in Africa. Special mention here goes to a direct statement of the official spokesperson of the head of the intelligence division of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, Yusov, and the ambassador of Ukraine to Senegal, Piravarov, saying that their country provided support to those who attacked Malian armed forces in Mali on the border with Algeria in the region of Tin Zawatin on the 25th and 27th of July. We underscore that this attack was carried out inter alia by a group affiliated to Al-Qaeda. The reaction from Sahel states was swift. The statement of the Malian government on this was disseminated as an official Security Council document from the 5th of August. And this was followed by official statements of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Burkina Faso and the representative of Niger. African states firmly condemned Ukraine's support for international terrorism on their continent and the open interference in their internal affairs and the destabilization of their circumstances. Mali and Niger, as we know, broke diplomatic relations with Ukraine. Even in the Western press, there is material published that the terrorist groups operating in Mali are being trained to use drones and explosives overseen by Ukrainian special services both on the territory of Ukraine and also on the territory of Mali in terrorist-controlled regions. We know firsthand about the terrorist essence of the Kiev regime. The Russian delegation on many occasions has brought specific factual information about the real face of the West's cherished Kiev regime, who, with a nod or with a supervision of or with close cooperation with their backers from NATO countries, have long been not shied away from using openly terrorist methods. Now we can see for ourselves with the terrorist attack by Ukrainian fighters on the Kursk region, carried out using Western-supplied weapons. Sufficient testimony has been posted online of how nationalists deliberately are shooting unarmed civilians, destroying civilian objects. In a word, they're acting just how 80 years ago their German fascist predecessors did, who they now idolize. And they will see the same end. And Western backers of Zelensky's junta and their terrorist activities are not only not criticized, but they're essentially justified. Being justified. This is a real merge of terrorists. The information that we had, and information confirmed by representatives of African states and European law enforcement agencies, for example, Europol, about Western-supplied weapons to Ukraine falling into the hands of terrorist groups and criminal groups in various regions of the world has been confirmed. We call on specialized experts for UN bodies to at least now not just shrug off this data, but carefully study it and assess on the basis of this, the role of Western special services and their Ukrainian disciples in the organization and abetting of this type of terrorist attacks. Colleagues, moreover, I'd like to recall that the existing sanctions regime 1267 provides for the imposition of sanctions against any individuals, groups or organizations affiliated to ISIL and Al-Qaeda. In order to fight terrorism, we think it's important to use this tried and tested mechanism to hold accountable those who actively assist terrorists, and also those who themselves don't hide these links and actively advertise them. Otherwise, all these grand statements and bombastic rhetoric on the need to fight international terrorism will ring hollow. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Thank you, President. I would like to thank USG Vladimir Voronkov and Director Natalia German for their briefings. Terrorism remains one of the most grave threats to international peace and security. This threat continues to evolve and to exploit vulnerabilities created by conflicts, political and humanitarian crises, and by climate change. The terrorist threat is still at an alarming level in West Africa and the Sahel. Al-Qaeda remains particularly established there through the Jenim, its Sahel branch, much like Daesh, which are intensifying their operations and expanding their networks. The activities of these groups jeopardizes the safety of civilians, aggravates instability in the region, and compromises prospects for development. I won't forget also other regions of the world where the terrorist threat remains high, particularly in Central Asia, where the expansion of ISIL Khorasan poses a major security threat. Terrorist groups such as Daesh continue, additionally, to exploit the internet and social networks to increase the resonance of their attacks and also to spread propaganda based on disinformation and to recruit. President, only global and coordinated action of the international community will allow an efficient and sustainable response to the scourge of terrorism. The use of force can be necessary to counter terrorist groups. France, whose military have fought to drive back terrorism, commends the work done by African soldiers working on the continent in regional counterterrorism initiatives. France and the European Union continue to support these efforts, particularly by providing support to the mixed multinational force created by the states in the Lake Chad Basin to combat the expansion of Boko Haram and now that of Daesh. But exclusively military solutions will never suffice. Our efforts to fight terrorism must take a holistic approach to address all the causes of the threat. It's important to put at the heart of our work the preservation of fundamental rights and freedoms, strengthening governance structures and the rule of law, as well as the resilience of most vulnerable communities and the fight against disinformation and the spread of extremist content. We must also develop partnerships based on dialogue that seek to meet the needs expressed by states and people affected by terrorism. To this end, Côte d'Ivoire and France created an international academy for counter-terrorism, which seeks to build capacity of countries in the region, not only in the operational field, but also in terms of analysis of the threat and the judicial aspects too. The security responses that are vaunted by some private military companies run counter to this integrated approach that respects partners and populations. Their practice aggravate the instability and fuel terrorism through their human rights violations. On this occasion, I must respond to some unfounded accusations by the Russian Federation, but I will just recall that the solutions proposed by the Russian Federation are not likely to improve the protection of civilians in the Sahel either. In terms of these accusations on occasions, there is not anything to do with the topic proposed by the presidents for today's discussion. We've had many opportunities to discuss this, and we will have more. We'll have regarding the illegal aggression against Ukraine by Russia. France finally reiterates its support to the United Nations, who's providing an essential contribution to the fight against terrorism. We plan to continue on to support training and capacity building work carried out by the UNOCT, working with regional organisations for the benefit of West African countries. France reiterates its commitment to resolutions adopted by the Security Council to fight terrorism in all its aspects, including cutting off its sources of financing. We commend the recent adoption of the Resolution 2734, which renewed the mandate of the monitoring team of the 1267 sanctions regime and now takes into account sexual and gender-based violence in sanctions listing requests. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Voronkov and Executive Director German for their updates and recognize their efforts in preparing the report being considered today. Mr. President, terrorism continues to threaten global peace and security and negatively impact the socio-economic well-being of states. Guyana condemns terrorism in all its forms and underscores the need to hold all perpetrators accountable. Regrettably, terrorism is on the increase. According to the Institute for Economics and Peace Global Terrorism Index, deaths from terrorism increased by 22% in 2023, reaching 8,352 deaths, the highest level since 2017. The average number of deaths per terrorist attack has also increased, indicating that attacks have become more deadly. Contributing factors to this growing threat include unemployment, unmet economic expectations, technological advancements, extremist ideologies, inequalities and marginalization, and weak governance. These factors are further compounded by challenges related to climate change and food security, insecurity in many areas. In sum, Mr. President, there is a close link between underdevelopment and terrorism, reinforcing the conviction that there can be no peace without sustainable development and no sustainable development without peace. Guyana is particularly concerned about the growing recruitment, radicalization, and victimization of youths by terrorist groups and the increased involvement of children in terrorist activities. In the Secretary General's report on children and armed conflict, it was noted that the highest number of violations against children in armed conflict involve recruitment, use, and abduction, violations that are key to the activities of terrorist groups that use children in their operations. In fact, the report confirms that children were detained for actual or alleged association with armed groups, including those designated as terrorist groups by the United Nations. Mr. President, Guyana remains concerned about the threat posed by ISIL to Africa, especially in West Africa and the Sahel. We are particularly alarmed at the high number of internally displaced persons, the complex attacks against security forces, the incidents of harassment and extortion, as well as the number of mass atrocities against civilians in West Africa and the Sahel. The significant impact of Daesh activities on children in Central Sahel is concerning. We note, for example, that the terrorist group ISWAP is abducting, recruiting, and sexually violating children. Guyana condemns these actions in the strongest terms and calls for all perpetrators to be held accountable. Children are among the most vulnerable groups, and everything must be done to protect them. The general deterioration in the protection of civilians and the ongoing violations of human rights must also cease. Guyana shares the concern of the Secretary General about the risk posed by the continued expansion of terrorist groups for increasing instability across West Africa and the Sahel. We therefore welcome the launch of the Abuja process in April to coordinate and mobilize resources for counterterrorism in the African region. It is important for the international community to fully support this process. We also acknowledge the efforts of the United Nations and its agencies in countering the threat posed by Daesh by enhancing capacities in border management and security and strengthening cooperation between international partners and African member states, among other areas. Mr. President, to effectively counter the threat of terrorism, including in West Africa and the Sahel region, we must target its root causes. Preventive measures should therefore be geared toward addressing structural poverty and inequality, economic disparities, and lack of education, among others. We must also examine the incidence of unconstitutional change in government, since this impacts the region's stability and the strength of its democracy. The international community must also continue to support the counterterrorism initiatives of regional bodies, including ECOWAS. There must be deliberate strategies for active and continuous collaboration between government stakeholders and local communities for combating terrorism. Youth participation in this is pivotal. Regional and international cooperation is also key to these preventive measures, including in the areas of capacity building for law enforcement and judiciary personnel, enhancing border security, sharing of intelligence, and disruption of terrorist financing. Mr. President, as the ones most disproportionately affected by terrorist activities, youth's increased participation in the decision-making processes for anti-terrorism laws and policies should be at the center of preventive measures. Investments in the education and empowerment of youths must be prioritized. They must also have adequate opportunities for meaningful employment to prevent them from being targets for recruitment by terrorist groups. Guyana emphasizes the obligation of member states to take adequate steps to prevent and suppress the financing of terrorist acts and to refrain from providing support to entities or persons involved in such acts. In closing, I wish to reiterate Guyana's commitment to working with the international community to address the challenges posed by terrorism consistent with international law, international human rights law, and the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank Undersecretary General Voronkov and the Executive Director German for their informative briefings. Our thanks also go to the monitoring team. Mr. President, reports on the threat posed by Daesh consistently contain the observation that despite sustained and relatively successful counterterrorism efforts, terrorist groups are showing adaptability and resilience. Slovenia is concerned by the reported trends related to the use, exploitation, and misuse of new and emerging technologies such as drones, financing through cryptocurrencies, and spreading terrorist narrative by the using of the artificial intelligence. While responses tend to lack, it is all the more imperative that national and international efforts, including measures adopted by this Council, follow suit and become more flexible. States need to build a robust counter-terrorist structure and more capacity to fight terrorism on these new fronts. All efforts need to be comprehensive, inclusive, and cooperative in order to be effective. On this note, we welcome the clarification in the Resolution 2734 on ISIL and Al-Qaeda sanctions regime that sexual and gender-based violence constitute a form of terrorism and is thereby part of the listing criteria when perpetrated by these groups. Mr. President, Slovenia shares the concern about the disproportionate impact of terrorist threat in fragile and conflict-affected environments, particularly in West Africa and the Sahel, and welcomes the focus of today's discussion on the region. With a predominant focus on the kinetic counter-terrorism operations in the region, we would like to emphasize the pivotal role of tackling the drivers of terrorism. Social and economic circumstances, human rights violations and abuses, effects of climate change and competition for natural resources, as well as intra- and intercommunal tensions, all serve as drivers of radicalization, which are exploited by terrorists for recruitment and spreading of their narratives. They must be addressed through comprehensive, inclusive, human rights-based, and gender-responsive efforts in partnership with civil society and local communities. The most effective way to fight terrorism is from the ground up, starting with building strong democratic institutions and resilience of local communities. The UN Messenger of Peace, Malala Yousafzai, said, I quote, "With guns, you can kill terrorists. With education, you can kill terrorism," unquote. Education not only enables critical thinking, but also opens up opportunities, lack of which is one of the main drivers, in particularly for children and youth, to seek alternatives. Regional and international support and cooperation are essential in these endeavors, as terrorism does not abide and is not restricted by national borders. In this context, we welcome the launch of the Abuja process that we are confident will lead to increased cooperation. Slovenia advocates for effective coordination of the existing counter-terrorism initiatives in the region and prevention of local fragmentation of the efforts. Mr. President, we recognize the drawdown of UNITAD and their efforts to categorize and organize the evidence collected before handing it over to the Iraqi authorities. However, in our opinion, the end of UNITAD mandate does not mean that its intended goal, namely helping to ensure accountability of the members of Daesh, have been fully realized. Much attention has been paid to accountability mechanism in the Middle East. However, because of the shift of Daesh activity to Africa, notably to West Africa and the Sahel, additional focus is needed to fight impunity and ensure accountability in the region. Perpetrators of terrorist acts, regardless of who or where they are, should be brought to justice. Accountability is also an essential part of the counter-terrorism efforts, not just in order to satisfy the states or to signal to perpetrators the unacceptability of their actions, but above all, to show the victims of terrorism that have gone through unimaginable trauma, that they are hurt, and hopefully bring them some closure. I thank you.
I thank the representatives of Slovenia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I wish to thank briefers for their very detailed briefings. Our meeting today is of crucial importance because, as emerges clearly in the report of the Secretary General, the threat that terrorism poses to international peace and security remains very high. Moreover, terrorist groups are showing flexibility and the ability to adapt in spite of international and regional efforts taken to combat that scourge. Africa remains the continent most affected by terrorist operations. This threat is spreading. It's growing in scope and its extent. It's spreading to various regions of the African continent. Indeed, Western Africa and the Sahel are the regions most affected in Africa by terrorism. Terrorist groups harness instability, socioeconomic instability and political instability, that is, as well as protracted conflicts to conduct their operations, because these phenomena create a fertile breeding ground to recruit new followers into the ranks of terrorist groups. Mr. President, the nexus between terrorism and transnational organized crime is one which is growing ever stronger. Indeed, terrorist groups continue to exploit the smuggling, drug trafficking, and the illegal exploitation of natural resources to turn a profit. The decentralized structures of terrorist groups have allowed them to extend the reach of their activities and to control vast swathes of territory. The role of the United Nations in terms of supporting member states to fight against terrorism deserves our recognition, as including the global counterterrorism strategy. However, we must promote cooperation between the United Nations and the African Union. Indeed, the African Union plays a pivotal role in fighting against this scourge. The African Union has the capacities necessary to promote transnational cooperation and to exchange information and intelligence, including through the Intelligence Committee and the African Union Center to Combat Terrorism. Moreover, Afripol plays a pivotal role in preventing and countering transnational organized crime, as well as terrorism and cybercrime. It is for that reason that we must allow the African Union to conduct operations to combat terrorism, and we must do that by allocating sustainable, predictable and sufficient funding to the African Union to this end. Mr. President, as AU coordinator for the fight against terrorism and violent extremism, the President of Algeria, Abdelmajid Tebboune, has reiterated Algeria's commitment to African-wide common action to counter this scourge. To do that, the President of Algeria has recommended measures aiming to bolster the capacities of African governments to fight against terrorism. This includes the following measures. 1. Adopting a new continent-wide action plan to counter terrorism, which would replace the 2003 agenda. 2. Activating the African Trust Fund to counter terrorism. 3. Establishing an African list with the names of persons and groups involved in terrorist acts, and 4. Activating African arrest warrants. Mr. President, given that I'm talking about Algeria's role as chair of the Counterterrorism Committee of the Security Council, allow me to underscore a number of measures which we view as priorities and indeed urgent. Fighting against institutional red tape to quickly adapt to the terrorist threat, which continues to evolve and which is indeed constantly evolving. We must treat flexibility and early response as matters of urgency so that we can ensure our responses are effective as possible. We must establish sanctions regimes which are effective. in order to strengthen the global framework, the global counterterrorism framework. We must do that to hamper the activities of terrorist groups. We must also bolster border security capacities in view of the fact that borders are porous in the Sahel and the Sahara. The borders are too long. We also need to deal with the threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters. We need to dry up the sources of terrorist financing. That all comes from ransom, the product of cross-border, transnational organized crime and drug trafficking. We must also prevent the access of terrorist groups to small arms and light weapons and prevent terrorist access to drones. We must also prevent and counter the use of IEDs by terrorist groups, namely in the west of Africa. We must also strengthen national and regional capacities to counter the use of certain things for criminal ITCs rather for criminal ends. We must tackle criminal cyber networks. We must tackle inequalities, unemployment, extremism and marginalization, which are the root causes of terrorism. Finally, we must strengthen good governance and the rule of law in order to build people's trust in their governments. Doing that requires justice-based approaches that are also grounded in protection, inclusion, education, and social services that should be extended to all. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I also thank USG Voronkov and Executive Director German for their briefings. We welcome the continued focus on the need to continuously enhance joint efforts in countering the threat of terrorism. The 19th report of the Secretary-General highlights with concern that the threat posed to international peace and security by Daesh remains high, with the group and its affiliates continuing to demonstrate resilience and adaptability despite sustained counterterrorism efforts. Malta is alarmed by the risk of resurgence of Daesh in the Middle East, by the ability of the Khorasan branch of the Islamic State to project threats outside Afghanistan, as well as by the continuous focus of the activities of Daesh in Africa. The proliferation of terrorism and violent extremism in West Africa and the Sahel continues to require our immediate attention. We believe that our collective goals in addressing and curbing the threat of terrorism can be achieved through capacity-building efforts aimed at enhancing capabilities of intelligence authorities, the judiciary, law enforcement agencies, and military authorities. In this regard, we commend important counterterrorism initiatives of the European Union in Africa, such as the European Union's military training missions in Somalia and Mozambique, the EU's support for the creation of dedicated gendarmerie counterterrorism units in the Sahel, the European Peace Facility's support for the efforts of the Lake Chad Basin countries and the Trans-Regional Multinational Joint Task Force, and the EU's funding of the Global Facility of the Malta-based International Institute of Justice and Rule of Law on counterterrorism platform for human rights engagements, which is providing capacity-building activities to a number of African countries. Malta also supports the proactive use of targeted sanctions to counter the threat of Daesh and Al-Qaeda, as well as their affiliates. We welcome the recent renewal of the 1267 sanctions regime through Resolution 2734 in this regard. President, security-centered approaches to counterterrorism must be accompanied by efforts that are human rights-based, gender-responsive, and not in conflict with the humanitarian principles or conduct of principled humanitarian action. In this regard, states must ensure that counterterrorism laws and practices comply with international human rights standards, that perpetrators are held accountable for human rights violations, including sexual and gender-based violence, linked to terrorism, and that women's participation in decision-making processes related to counterterrorism and security is continuously promoted. As the report highlights, women, girls, and boys face serious risks of gender-based violence by terrorist groups. Malta is deeply concerned by the report's references to Islamic State's grave violations against girls in particular, through abduction, recruitment, and sexual violence. Malta is also alarmed that the situation faced by thousands of individuals, mostly women and children, in camps and other facilities in the northeast of the Syrian Arab Republic remains dire. Sustained humanitarian assistance remains key. We reiterate the importance of preventive approaches within national policy frameworks. Meaningful engagement with youth groups, women-led organizations, and civil society fosters community resilience while preventing radicalization. In this regard, a whole-of-society approach that promotes education and literacy skills is a powerful tool in preventing and countering violent extremism. Advancing literary skills across all populations also ensures the success of numerous global and national strategic communications campaigns aimed at mitigating the scourge of terrorism. President, in conclusion, as we approach the International Day of Remembrance and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism, marked every year on 21st August, we recognize the pivotal role of victims and survivors as agents for peace. We are reminded of our duty to advance the protection, promotion, and respect of the rights of victims of terrorism. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank Under-Secretary General Voronkov and Executive Director Gehrman for their briefings. Terrorism continues to imperil international stability and security. Its impact transcends borders and indiscriminately affects communities, altering the social fabric and weakening the rule of law. In areas where underlying factors have helped to sow instability and conflict, terrorism is increasing both its presence and influence. Young people are particularly vulnerable to recruitment, whilst women and girls are subject to sexual and gender-based violence. My delegation shares the concern expressed at the threat that Daesh and its affiliates constitute for international peace and security. The attacks perpetrated in Kerman and Moscow demonstrate that no region is immune to this scourge. Moreover, there is a growing risk that the operative, financial and logistical autonomy that Daesh affiliates enjoy in Daesh and Western Africa and the Sahel, will create an ever larger area of instability. Against this backdrop, the trends identified in the Secretary General's report are of concern and call for attention and action in at least three spheres. Firstly, the transnational and decentralized nature of Daesh and its affiliate groups compel us to use a multilateralism-centered strategy, as well as one which is grounded in information exchange and cross-border cooperation. Consequently, we commend the organization of the high-level African counterterrorism meeting in Abuja last April. That meeting addressed regional cooperation and the creation of institutions to tackle the evolving terrorist threat in Africa. We also commend the holding of the third meeting of the Marrakesh platform in June. Secondly, we know that in order to recruit followers and build their capacities, terrorist groups are increasingly availing themselves of emerging technologies, new financial instruments, and unmanned aerial systems. Consequently, the UN, through the Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, seated UNODC, and with the support of the Financial Action Task Force, must build states' capacities to tackle these new challenges, including the nexuses between terrorism and organized crime. Thirdly, it cannot be denied that terrorism cannot be wiped out using security-based measures alone. Rather, we also need to champion a comprehensive strategy in order to eradicate its root causes. Consequently, we must promote sustainable economic and social development and break the vicious cycle whereby poverty and exclusion become a breeding ground for violent extremism. UNDP report suggests that the hope of finding a job is the primary or the lack of hope, rather, of finding a job is the primary factor which drives people in sub-Saharan Africa to join the ranks of violent extremist groups. I wish to underscore the need to address the humanitarian situation of those suspected of being members of Daesh and their families detained in centres in the northeast of Syria. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Mozambique commends the Sierra Leone presidency for convening this briefing on global counterterrorism efforts. We thank the briefers for sharing their perspective on the topic. Mr. President, the global spread of the terrorism is a matter of grave concern as it threatens international peace and security and undermines global stability and prosperity. We are at a pivotal junction. Volatility and conflicts in regions like the Middle East and parts of Africa, including West Africa and the Sahel region, provide fertile grounds for terrorist groups to escalate their operations. The persistence of groups such as Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara underscores the urgent need for coordinated and comprehensive international counterterrorism measures and actions. The ability of these terrorist groups to infiltrate with ongoing conflicts, utilize emerging technology, and merge with criminal networks presents a multifaceted challenge that requires a differentiated and vigorous response. As the concept note points out, terrorism cannot be eradicated by security measures alone. Effective counterterrorism strategy must be a multifaceted package of political, economic, judicial, and social responses to address the root causes of radicalization. Mozambique emphasizes a collective, integrated approach to counterterrorism that upholds the rule of law, human rights, and gender inclusion, as rightly outlined in the new Agenda for Peace. We therefore call for the swift implementation of the UN counterterrorism strategy, the African Union Declaration of Terrorism and Unconstitutional Change of Government, as well as the outcomes of the April 2024 high-level African counterterrorism meeting in Abuja, Nigeria. We commend regional organizations' efforts, including those from ECOWAS and the African Union. We look forward to leveraging UN Security Council Resolution 2719 to enhance Africa's response capabilities. These frameworks remain critical tools in our arsenal towards our collective actions. Mr. President, while acknowledging that preventing terrorism and countering violent extremism require robust regional and national strategies that are inclusive and uphold the rule of law and human rights, Mozambique remains committed to combating terrorism via collective and integrated approach through national actions and international cooperation. It is in this context that Mozambique is committed to combating terrorism with the support of its bilateral, regional, and international partners. We are also committed to the obligations set forth by the pertinent instrument of the United Nations, the African Union, and the Southern African Development Community. Mr. President, at national level, Mozambique has ratified Law number 14/2023, which establishes the legal framework and measures for the prevention and combat money laundering and terrorist financing, and has undertaken a series of security, legal, judicial, and administrative actions. Mozambique is also implementing the Northern Resilience and Integration Development Program that aims to restore peace and promote sustainable development through a multidisciplinary and integrated approach which addresses human rights, gender, youth, food security, climate resilience, and development. We are mindful that the active participation and collaboration of local communities play a crucial role in preventing radicalization and promoting social cohesion, particularly in the northern provinces affected by armed violence since 2017. In conclusion, Mr. President, Mozambique reaffirms its commitment to support national, bilateral, sub-regional, regional, and international counterterrorism efforts. We believe that through united and concerted actions, we can effectively combat the endemic spread of terrorism and pave the way for a more secure and prosperous future for Africa and the world at large. Let us continue to stand together, strengthen our cooperation, and upholding our shared values of peace, security, and human dignity by silencing the guns in Africa, our shared vision for a peaceful Africa. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representatives of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Mr. President, I wish to thank Under-Secretary General Voronkov and Assistant Secretary General Gehrman for their presentations. I would also like to convey our appreciation for the new format of the Secretary General report. We find it to be conducive to our discussions. Attacks perpetrated across the world prove that terrorism continues to constitute a grave risk to international peace and security. The continued expansion of terrorist groups in West Africa and the Sahel is a destabilizing factor for the region in its entirety. Signs of the resurgence of ISIL in the Middle East and the threat emanating from Afghanistan through ISIL-K and other groups, as well as persistent attacks by al-Shabaab in Somalia, are also worrying developments which require our sustained attention. The global threat posed by terrorism comes in many regional and local forms. The use of a one-size-fits-all standard approach will not deliver the solutions we wish to see. A better understanding of each specific context, as well as inclusive and concerted action and constant review of our efforts, are vital if we are to achieve lasting results. Allow me to emphasize 2 points in this regard. Firstly, we must prioritize prevention. Relying solely on strictly security-based approaches is insufficient and could even worsen the situation. Indeed, new grievances may emerge and be exploited by the very same actors we are seeking to defeat. Our actions must therefore be holistic and coherent, grounded in international law, in particular in international humanitarian law and human rights law. These are key elements that Switzerland has incorporated into its recently updated national counter-terrorism strategy and into its action plan to combat radicalization and violent extremism. We commend the fact that sexual and gender-based violence are criteria that have been added to listing for the sanctions regime under 1267. All efforts must be targeted, effective and measurable. We welcome the President's suggestion to more closely examine the situation in West Africa and the Sahel. The counter-terrorism strategy should strengthen its engagement with the states in this region. In so doing, it could serve to create a better understanding of most recent developments and to ensure that the support of the international community is closely aligned with needs on the ground. Moreover, we must ensure that we are able to measure the success of the UN's engagement in order to recalibrate efforts and tailor them to needs to ultimately achieve the best possible results. In this connection, we must prioritize the implementation of OP 96 of the 8th review of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy, namely the development of a results framework. that will make it possible to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of the strategy's implementation. Mr. President, it is vital that we constantly improve our understanding of the myriad factors leading to violent extremism and terrorism, including the latest observations on the effects of climate change or technological innovation. Doing that requires robust engagement with the states concerned, but also sustainable partnerships with stakeholders such as civil society actors, local actors directly affected, and the private sector. We have, in recent decades, built up solid networks. Let us continue to develop them and use them to better understand the challenges of today, the challenges of tomorrow, so that we can overcome them. Thank you.
Thank the representatives of Switzerland for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Sierra Leone. Let me start by thanking our esteemed briefers, Under Secretary General Vladimir Voronkov and Assistant Secretary General Ms. Natalia German, for their invaluable insight on the evolving threats posed by ISIL and associated individuals and groups. We acknowledge the important work by United Nations Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact entities in addressing these threats and attacks, their impact and the underlying conditions conducive for its entrenchment and spread. I also thank Council members for the additional focus on the Sahel and West Africa region and the call for the most urgent support for the countries in the region. Sierra Leone welcomes the 19th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by Daesh to international peace and security, and recalling the commitment of the Council in adopting Resolution 1373, 1377, and 2253, affirming that a sustained, comprehensive approach with active participation and collaboration by states and organizations is essential to combating the scourge of international terrorism. While sanction regimes continue to serve as an effective tool in the fight against terrorism, Sierra Leone notes further that the 1267, 1373, and 1540 committees play crucial and complementary roles, and Sierra Leone reiterates its support to expedite the conclusion of a comprehensive convention on international terrorism. We call for renewed commitment and innovative thinking to move the working group forward and deliver on a collective mandate to further develop CCIT legal framework. Colleagues, terrorist organizations thrive in environments of social exclusion, inequality, and the relegation of human rights. These groups deliberately seek out deeply disillusioned, marginalized, and desperate people as fighter ground to propagate their so-called ideologies. Environments with limited opportunities for education and economic empowerment, depriving a significant size of the population, like the youth, of a dignified life, are particularly susceptible to instability, with women and girls usually affected the most. It is an unfortunate reality that these socio-economic deficiencies are further exacerbated by the negative effects of climate change and natural disasters. Over the past years, the global terrorist threat has evolved, with increased attacks by Daesh, its affiliates, and its supporters. ISIS branches and their affiliates have expanded their influence beyond Iraq and Syria, encompassing a wider population consisting mainly of youth, to now reaching across the globe to Central Sahel and the West African region. This new epicenter of terrorism accounts for almost 50% of all deaths from terror acts globally. Whilst highlighting the dire security situation in the Central Sahel and the West African region, we wish to share the following reflections. Firstly, addressing the root causes of terrorism is key to preventing further entrenchment and spread. Despite continuing to face leadership attrition and financial setbacks, Daesh and its affiliates have retained their capacity to conduct terrorist attacks and project a threat beyond the areas of operation through cells established and facilitation network, including in northwest Nigeria, through the Islamic State West African province and support for Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. Addressing the root causes of terrorism, therefore, will be critical to prevent the evident further entrenchment and spread. Secondly, we share the concern of the Secretary General the risk that the continued expansion of terrorist groups will result in an expanding area of instability across West Africa and the Sahel, especially if Daesh affiliates are allowed to enjoy greater operational, financial, and logistical autonomy. The magnitude and complexity of the problem are alarming and require concerted action. In this regard, the launch of the Abuja process, which aims to develop a comprehensive African-led and owned strategy to address the growing threat of terrorism on the continent, represents a positive development. A coordinated approach to this transnational threat cannot be overemphasized. Thirdly, we note with grave concern from the report that the situation in West Africa and the Sahel has not changed since the previous report, and that the FUCAN office in the region has grown in importance and capacity. Additionally, we have serious concerns regarding the impact of Daesh operations on children in the Central Sahel region, with a constant deterioration in the protection of civilians and frequent violation of human rights affecting the people and the property. Recalling the Area Formula meeting organized by Sierra Leone and co-sponsored by the A3+ members, Algeria, Guyana, and Mozambique, on combating the rise of terrorism and violent extremism in West Africa and the Sahel, we reiterate our call for a scale-up comprehensive response to not only tackle the scourge of terrorism, but also to ameliorate threat multipliers, such as growing food insecurity, climate change-induced adversities, health and educational concerns, and the alarming mass forcible displacement of people in the region. Colleagues, strengthening security and regulatory frameworks and accountability mechanisms for coordinated response at the national, regional, and international levels is of paramount importance. In our experience, state institutions can be capacitated to effectively deter, investigate, and prosecute terrorist activity. In Sierra Leone, through the newly reformed laws on anti-money laundering, combating of financing of terrorism, and financing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, Central Intelligence and Security Agency, cybersecurity strength, we have established a network of institutions to prevent and hold responsible actors, supporters, and financiers of terrorist activity internally and across borders. In addition to national efforts, regional and international cooperation is critical for addressing terrorism. Terrorist groups often exploit porous borders, weak border controls, and security vulnerabilities for cross-border illegal trafficking of weapons, drugs, and people. Sierra Leone particularly welcomes efforts to strengthen regional cooperation and institutional building in the West African Sahel region, including the high-level African Counterterrorism meeting in Abuja, with support from the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism in April 2024, which launched the Abuja process for mobilization of resources. We commend the work of the Office of Counterterrorism in providing technical assistance to a number of states and facilitating regional cooperation. We urge continued logistical, financial, technical, and technological support for regional initiatives, particularly to implement the decisions in the communique of the 65th Ordinary Session of the Authority of Heads of State and Government of ECOWAS, held on the 7th July 2024, to fully operationalize the multinational joint task force of the Accra Initiative and the Lake Chad Basin in response to rapidly evolving and sophisticated activities of terrorist groups and criminal organizations in West Africa and the Sahel. Preventing terrorists from accessing financial resources is also crucial to successfully sustaining gains in counterterrorism. We note efforts of the Financial Action Task Force and call for enhanced UN coordination with the FATF in identifying and remedying weaknesses in anti-money laundering and counter-terror financing frameworks. We call on all member states to reaffirm their collective responsibility and commitment for zero tolerance of terrorism. It is crucial that all member states fulfill their obligation in international counterterrorism instruments and conventions. This collective responsibility must transcend political interest, and external influence must be leveraged in a positive and constructive manner. We must not countenance double standards, and terrorists should not be seen through the lens of a specific religion, region, or ethnicity. It is essential that the credibility of the multilateral system in addressing these threats is maintained, and we improve and uphold the working methods of the committees dealing with sanctions and counterterrorism to achieve greater transparency and accountability in their work. Enlisting and delisting individuals and entities under the UN sanctions regimes must be done objectively, transcending political or religious reasons. Proposals in this regard merit due examination before circulation so as not to erode our collective credibility. Let me conclude, colleagues, with a final thought on this year's Summit of the Future, which provides an opportunity to reinvigorate multilateralism in critical areas, including threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts. Improving our global response to terrorism must play a central role in the new agenda for peace, uniting stakeholders from the security, humanitarian, development, and peace-building sectors to achieve a future without terrorism. As threats to international peace and security continue to evolve, the Security Council must evolve in its approach to ensure the collective security mandate to ensure prompt and effective action is fully realized. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give the floor to them.
Thank you, Mr. President. I apologize for taking the floor once again, but I need to respond to some remarks made earlier by a representative of the Russian Federation. Once again, he tried to politicize the global effort to eradicate terrorism. The growing threat of terrorism, especially in the Middle East, is something we can only tackle effectively as a united global community. So in that vein, I call on Russia to use its real and growing influence with terrorist groups such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, and with Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, to end their terrorist attacks which threaten to ignite a greater war in the region. One last point, Mr. President. In response to comments made by the representative of the Russian Federation about a U.S. presence in Syria, as we have said many times, and I will just say it once more, U.S. forces are in Syria only, and I repeat only, to fight and combat ISIS. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.